Welcome to the final episode of our first series of Let's Talk WEM, the CIWEM podcast which keeps you right up to date with current issues in the world of water and environmental management. We've talked to the key figures across our industry and taken a deep dive into some of the biggest challenges and topics we're all facing at the moment. We're grateful to our series sponsor, Yorkshire Water, whose support has helped us to share these conversations and bring this podcast idea to life. I'm Niki Roach. I'm the president of CIWEM, and the theme of my presidency is Everything is Connected. And when we set out to make this podcast, I wondered what connections we might find, and I really hope you've enjoyed hearing our guests make some really powerful links throughout this first season. I feel like a lot of our episodes have been building up to the theme of this final podcast. We've discussed the importance of advocacy, we've talked about the impact of flooding and the power of working alongside communities to create resilience. We've heard about the importance of ensuring everyone in our sector feels safe and valued in order to deliver their best, and we've considered the similarities as well as differences that exist globally in our use of water. So in this final episode, we'll be talking all about our demand for water. And I'm joined by another wonderful co-host to share their opinions and expert analysis on the topic. Sophie Broadfield, who is the Deputy Director of Water for the Department of Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA, here in the UK. Sophie's responsible in DEFRA for the overall regulatory system for water companies in England, overseeing the relationship with Ofwat and engagement with the water industry. And she also leads on ensuring that there is a secure and sustainable supply of water in the long term, including the need to reduce overall demand for water to respond to climate change and population growth pressures. And previously, Sophie's worked in MHCLG, which I think is the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I'm sure she'll correct me if I'm wrong, on local government finance reform and also in the Treasury and Department for Education. So welcome, Sophie. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm sure you know the score by now, so Sophie and I are going to listen to our guest interview together and then we'll discuss our reflections. Our guest interview today is a bit of a bumper edition with three fantastic guests. We're going to hear from Niki Russell, the Managing Director of Waterwise, a charity in the UK focusing on water efficiency, Andrew Tucker, the Water Efficiency Manager for Thames Water, and Rob Lawson, a Director of Artesia and the Chair of the CIWEM Water Resources Technical Panel. And I was particularly interested to hear about the impact COVID has had on our demand for water.
Our kind of predictive models of the relationship between weather and water demand were kind of blown out the window by COVID to some degree. We used a lot more water in that summer period because we were all at home.
COVID's had a massive impact. We're seeing a completely different way of how water is being used between households and businesses. When you look at the water use patterns because of COVID, it's like having 7 weekend days.
So, Sophie, before we head to our guest interview, I would love to hear why reducing our demand for water is important to you.
I applied for this job when I was on maternity leave. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and at the time I had a baby. And DEFRA, my department, advertised this job along with another one on air quality. And so the job advert sat there and it said, "Would you like to lead on water or on air?" And I just thought, how amazing. These things are so important. I would absolutely love to be involved in that. And as you heard from the intro, I don't have a background in working on environmental policy. And that's what gets me up in the morning now, and what I motivate the team with is our responsibility for ensuring that there's water coming out of the tap. Because families need water, clearly just for life, for staying alive, but for everything. You know, what would I do if the water suddenly switched off and I had to go to standpipes to get my water? It would be really difficult, and I love the fact that we're involved in stopping that happen.
It's great to hear that water is a priority for the government. And that's something I got the chance to ask Rebecca Pow MP, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at DEFRA, about when I spoke to her a few days ago.
We are delivering our 25-year environment plan, and within that, targets on dealing with water in a whole range of areas, but also looking at water efficiency will be set so that we can actually make a much more use of this resource, and indeed it needs to be sustainable.
And you can hear more from Rebecca Pow at the end of this episode. So, Sophie, how well do you think we manage water in the UK at the moment?
Hey, look, I think we do it pretty well, actually. We're going to talk today about the improvements that we need to make, and obviously there are improvements. But I see a water industry staffed by people who have the same passion for public service as my colleagues have in the civil service. And we have quite an organised system. At DEFRA, sitting in government, we get contacted all the time by other countries asking for advice about how they can copy what we do here, in terms of how we run the provision of water in this country. So I think we have a lot to be proud of. We're going to hear, I think, a bit about what other countries do better than us on water demand. That's where we need to learn from our Australias and from South Africas and things like that. But we've got a lot to be proud of to start off with.
Well, let's get into it in that case then. It's time for the big interview. Let's hear from Nicci, Andrew and Rob. Let's get started around understanding what water means to you all. Before we get into the topic specifically, this is a sector that we all feel pretty passionate about. So maybe, Nicci, if I come to you first, what does water and water saving mean to you?
Well, I run an environmental campaigning organisation, and I do care a lot about the environment. But for me, the water efficiency stuff is about social justice, because I very strongly feel it's not going to be the people that have got all sorts of privileges now, whether that's privileges of income, race, whatever. We're not going to be the people that suffer when the water starts running out. And that's actually a challenge right across the UK, right here, right now.
Rob, how about yourself?
For me, it's definitely about the environment. If you read my LinkedIn profile, it's got this cheesy bit at the top that says, at the age of 11, I stood in a stream and wondered where all the water came from and where it went to. It is genuine. It's just that fascination. At the end of the day, it's us people that use water that comes out of the environment, and how we do that and what we do with that water is really, really important. And that's what drives me.
And Andrew, how about yourself?
For us, it's about, we've got roughly 10 million people completely reliant on the product, 3.7 million homes, 250,000 businesses, not really thinking about where it's from and how it gets there, but it's just part of their daily life. I've been through crisis drought. It's horrible. There's absolutely nothing nice about it at all. So being able to proactively reduce the risk of it is kind of fundamental to that long-term security supply and just getting on with our lives without having to worry about it.
It kind of takes me nicely into the first thing that I wanted to ask you all, which is, why should we bother? Give me a sense of how important it is and how urgent it is that we start to think differently about the water that we use.
I'd say it's super urgent. It's all happening right now. And if you just even look back at the last couple of years, right across the UK, there have been huge challenges supplying water to customers and drying up rivers and all sorts of things like that. If you think of areas of the UK that we traditionally think of as wet, like Scotland, Northern Ireland, parts of Wales, southwest of England, this isn't just an issue for the southeast and east of England. Some of the chief execs are saying, look, we're going to run out of water in 10 years if we don't start taking action now. We're already having shortages of supply. It's urgent. It's now. We need to get it sorted. It's as urgent as the climate emergency.
I think Nicci's right, definitely. The first lockdown nearly a year ago now, when we had exceptionally hot, dry weather, water companies were at their limits in terms of the amount of water that they could physically get into supply. And that wasn't an issue with the amount of water sat in reservoirs or rivers or aquifers. That was simply the fact that demand was at exceptional levels, and particularly in 2018, it was like that for a really prolonged period of time. Whether that is climate change is difficult to say. You can't relate individual weather events to climate change, but those sort of really prolonged events that we saw in 2018, I think the Met Office said was something like 50 times more likely under climate change. Southern Water are at a point in their most recent water resources plan where they're looking, fairly seriously at desalination. We are at a point where those sort of more extreme measures that you think would be pretty extraordinary in the UK are being considered.
Being able to balance, the whole water balance and looking at very, very long term, requires two things. A classic twin track approach. You kind of need the ability to have more water and new water sources available to you so you can move water around or have more storage. Ticks the big resilience box. But that twin track thing also requires a reduction in demand, kind of reliant on every single person out there, whether they're at home or at business, doing something just a little bit better. But both the water infrastructure and that behavior change, dare I say even cultural change of a population, those two things take a long time. We've already experienced water stress situations, near drought situations, and we fall into it very, very quickly in the UK. Surprisingly quickly, because we've got a large population taking from the system 24/7. So the outgoings are huge. But because the water infrastructure and that behavior change thing takes such a long time, we need to do this now in preparation for not just this summer or next summer, but also just being able to get by and have a standard water available to us in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. So that action has to happen now.
How much of a change can we as individuals actually make here? Rob?
I think it's quite an old stat, but it's still pretty accurate. I think that around 80-90% of the carbon emitted in the sort of human water cycle, from abstraction through to the treatment and pumping of it to people's homes and then disposal of the sewage, 80 or 90% of that is actually used in the home of the carbon, and that's largely associated with heating hot water. So for the showers and baths we have and so on. And so, individual actions at the household level are absolutely essential if we're going to tackle that. COVID's already been mentioned, and that's been a massive experiment in changes in those sort of infrastructures and cultural expectations that we've seen over the last year, just from people working at home, say. And, the evidence that we've seen through some work that we've done with the University of Manchester is that people are showering less because they're not going into work in the morning, huge amount more water use in the garden, people are at home. And it's those kind of combinations of the infrastructure, habits and the social expectations that really are at the root of behaviour change.
You talked about COVID, and I'm keen to explore actually what has COVID meant for the way that we use water. Has COVID had much of an impact?
COVID's had a massive impact. We're seeing a completely different way of how water is being used between households and businesses. And you not only get just a single answer for one water company, but you have to look at the different water resource zones. London is completely different from the Thames Valley area because of the different proportions of businesses versus homes, housing types, people moving in and out, the commuters have changed. The use of data to understand that with COVID impact is also highlighting just things that we didn't really know about in the past, such as continuous flows, people using water not just in the morning or in the day or in the evening, it's now continually through the day because we're working at home. When you look at the water use patterns because of COVID, it's like having 7 weekend days.
Yeah, we at Artesia, we've done a lot of work collaboratively with 16 water companies and the Environment Agency. Overall, the estimate is that total demand's gone up by about 2.5%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there's a big trade-off in there between changes in non-household demand, which is reduced significantly by between 40 and 75% in some sectors. So obviously, places like retail, hospitality have been particularly badly affected, and their water demand has reduced massively. Between October and March last year, what we saw was an increase in household demand of about 9%. There are differences between different areas, depending on people working at home, key workers and so on, and the kind of social demographics of the different water resource zones. And also the daily patterns of water use. The actual morning peak has reduced and the afternoon peak has increased a bit. But also, a really big increase in outdoor use. And our kind of predictive models of the relationship between weather and water demand were kind of blown out the window by COVID to some degree, because we used a lot more water in that summer period because we were all at home.
Nicci, I'm going to come to you in a second. I'm interested in whose responsibility it is individual actions can have an impact. But then if I'm being devil's advocate, we hear high leakage figures still. I think there is an undercurrent of the public quite understandably thinking, why should I make changes when I still see that water companies are far from perfect? So, somebody who heads up an NGO in this sector, whose responsibility is it to make this change, do you think?
Just on that kind of individual's point first, which you did mention again there, I think my challenge is that if we don't change behaviour now, then basically in 10, 20 years' time, maybe even sooner, the water's going to be so scarce and there'll be so many of us that we're all just going to have to massively change it in a crisis point. So it's a bit like when industry used to sign up, in the old days, sign up to a voluntary target to avoid a government target, mandatory target. It's a bit like that. We've all got something to bring here. It's not the water police. If you have an incredibly water efficient toilet, but somebody flushes it every single time they wipe their nose with a tissue, then that's clearly not going to work. And that's why we now run Waterwise campaigns right through the year. We used to run them, at particular peak points or in the run-up. So in terms of whose responsibility, it's everybody's. You're absolutely right about leakage. It's not that helpful for motivating water efficient behaviours or even awareness, to be honest. It can get in the way of that. So the industry have got something to bring, but one of the things I think has been really valuable in recent years is that government and regulators have started to recognise that they too have stuff to bring to the party. So we need this mandatory label that we've all been talking about, all of us around this podcast table, and now it's finally sort of almost going to happen. There were things like that were a slam dunk on, you could knock 30 litres off per capita consumption, which on average about 142, with that label if you attach other tools to it. So my short answer is it's a bit of everybody, and that includes manufacturers. So bathroom manufacturers are coming to the table. They've been working really closely with Andrew and Nathan in my team and others to try and fix the leaky loos issue, for example. So there's a long answer. The short answer is everybody.
I'm going to just bring Rob in for a second, because Rob, I know that you've been doing a little bit of work supporting the development of the Environment Bill. And I suppose Nicci's just talked about the importance of not just individual actions, but also the role of policy and regulation. Can you give me a sense of what we might expect and what you hope will come when the Environment Bill lands finally?
Yes, obviously the Environment Bill is covering a lot of really important areas, not just water, and within water itself it's also covering some diverse areas from metal mine pollution to agricultural pollution and obviously water demand. And water demand's one of the targets that is going to be set when the bill comes into force. The question is what kind of target you use, and there has been a lot of discussion and debate around that. The current view is that it's going to be something based on a term called distribution input, which is how much water that water companies put into supply. So it's about public water supply, number one. How much of that is used by us as individuals? So household demand, one of the measures of that is per capita consumption, measured in litres per head per day. Non-household demand, which still makes up around 20% of the total consumption. And obviously, as Nicci mentioned as well, leakage, which again is around 20 to 25% of the distribution input. Now, there's some clear targets already for leakage that the water companies have got to work to, aiming to reduce leakage by 50% by 2050. There's lots of numbers around the household consumption figure as well. The current view is that there'll be an overarching distribution input target, and then below that some individual targets for those three key different areas.
Andrew, I guess you've been keeping a close eye on what might be coming with your Thames hat on. So what are you hoping for?
If you step off the boat today, you land here and you go, okay, what's the status of the sector? We are a bit of an outlier when you look at other countries or cities or states or water resource zones that have similar demand reduction pressures or similar water stress pressures. For instance, there is no national target. There's no single national voice from a government around water efficiency to educate the public and change perceptions, break those myths. There's no universal metering. You go everywhere else in the world and everyone's been metered for decades, and that's just the standard. It's very difficult to fix something if you're not measuring it properly. And when you don't have metering across the board, you don't have a national target driving the agenda, you don't have labeling to inform every single product purchase and drive the manufacturing to become efficient, any wonder we're facing these challenges right now. So I think that the momentum that's been building over the last year or two to feed into an environment bill or maybe other forms of regulation that are required is absolutely essential. We're genuinely not going to make that step change unless you get those things in place. And those things, once in place, and if they are designed correctly and implemented and run correctly, it will engineer out a lot of unnecessary water usage or wastage, improving that resilience agenda much more than what we are at the moment. I think the bit that we need to kind of really step outside the box and look at is, at the moment, the primary responsibility for the entire water efficiency agenda is just put onto wholesale water companies. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. And we really need to look big picture around how to address an agenda as opposed to just trying to put plasters on something that genuinely needs surgery.
Yeah, just prompted by something Andrew said there, actually. I'm just thinking about the role of governments traditionally, very much for the greater good. And I think that it's a really obscene demonstration of privilege if governments don't do things that they think would be for the greater good because they think one group of the population won't want them now. Because it's really not those people that are currently in government that are going to be the ones suffering further down the line.
We're really grateful to our sponsor, Yorkshire Water, for making it possible to bring you this podcast series. If your organisation would like to find out more about sponsoring future episodes or series of Let's Talk WEM, just go to letstalkwem.ciwem.org to get all the information you need. Talk to me about compulsory metering, because I am really interested in whether you as professionals within this sector think that we should just get on and do it. And Nicci, thinking about your social justice opener, which was really powerful, what are the flip sides of compulsory metering? Rob, can I ask you first?
Yeah, sure. So the CIWEM position is that we think that metering is the fairest way to pay for water services. I remember I did a guest lecture at where I did my MSc, Imperial College, probably about 10 years ago now. And it was a very international audience. And there were actual gasps in the audience when I said at that time we were kind of at 35% meter penetration, and they didn't actually understand what that meant because it was such a bizarre concept. I think we're way behind the curve in terms of introducing widespread metering. Obviously, there's got to be the right kind of measures and safety nets in place for social tariffs for people who have affordability issues, and also for households with high water demands for medical reasons and that sort of thing. But that's not difficult. And so the government and the Environment Agency have been consulting recently on extending what's called the areas of serious water stress. Interestingly, it extends to probably most of England now. In Wales, there's no plans to introduce compulsory metering from the Welsh Government. My view, and I think probably CIWEM's view as well, is that if we're going to tackle these national problems UK-wide, there's no point just introducing metering where there is water stress. You need to introduce it where there isn't, so that more water is available in those areas to resolve those problems. And that's one of the key planks of the really good work that the National Infrastructure Commission did 2 or 3 years ago. So looking at new resources, yes, where possible, where environmentally appropriate, transfers, which needs enough water in the donor area to transfer to the recipient area. And thirdly, water efficiency, and metering is one of the key planks of that as well. So yeah, metering is, for us, it is a no-brainer. And smart metering.
So Andrew, give me a feel for what's Thames's metering penetration at the moment?
So we're just shy of 50%. So we're in the 40s meter penetration. We are in the middle of a compulsory meter rollout. Not the first to do this. Southern Water, Southeast Water have finished their compulsory meter rollouts. Affinity Water are also doing something similar. We're all in the southeast in the areas of highest water stress need. Where we're a little bit different is we're rolling out what we call AMI, or Advanced Meter Infrastructure. So we're, instead of relying on a manual read, like someone walking the streets and manually reading every one, or AMR, so automatic reads, maybe a drive-by, that might happen every month or every couple of months. We're getting hourly data back. Historically, we would get 1 million or 1.5 million meter reads a year. With the 500,000, we've just passed the 500,000th mark. We've got a long way to go, but we make great progress. But with those meters we've got in the ground now, we're getting over 11 million meter reads a day. So it's a completely game-changing sort of world we're entering, where you go from traditional water company, almost a big data company, almost overnight. The points that Rob made before are spot on. As a society and individuals, we pay for what we use with electricity, for gas, our shopping, our fuel. Having a meter and paying for what you use is still the fairer way to pay. The regulatory system at the moment probably doesn't really look meters as just another piece of kit, whereas the rest of the world does. You have a pipe, a pump, a meter, a treatment plant, a valve. A meter is just part of that suite of network infrastructure things. The sensitive bit comes around the tariffing and how you manage that. I think we actually all manage that incredibly well. In fact, we can help someone better once we've got them on the meter, because you have a closer relationship with what they use, so you communicate with them more often. Whilst on meter penetration, we are, as a country, playing catch up to the rest of the developed world. But we've actually got an opportunity. If we focus on the smarts, the advanced meter infrastructure, the data, the analytics, turning data to insight into action, we actually have the opportunity to leapfrog chunks of the world in how we understand and use water better. Our leakage on network is too high. We are working very hard to get that down. And the best way to find leaks is with meters. You can pinpoint where the water balance is out. You can pinpoint where those leaks are occurring. At the moment, whilst the consultation around metering and water stress classification is looking to improve it, and it will improve it, it's still effectively a bit of a plaster on something that does need surgery. And I put it out there, I question, why on earth is metering linked to the colour on a map?
To be devil's advocate for a second, we've just had World Water Day, and the theme is valuing water. I would imagine that rolling out compulsory metering will not be a cheap exercise. So people's bills go up. It's expensive to meter. And in areas that aren't in water stress, it's hard for water companies to justify that. Let me go to Andrew first, because you shook your head at me. So tell me I'm wrong, because I'm interested.
It's not that you're wrong, Nicci. Metering has always been an option here anyway. We've always had opt-in meters. We've been replacing meters. They're an asset. They have a lifespan, so you replace meters as well. The issue that those types of meter installation programs have is they're more expensive per meter. They actually cost the customer more. So by rolling out a compulsory and area-based program, you're implementing an economy of scale on something that is happening organically anyway. It takes more capital investment now. The way the regulatory system enables that economic burden to be brought across a longer period of time to minimize the impact on customers. The key thing is to get the infrastructure in as fast as you can, because what it will actually do is you'll realize the benefits earlier.
It's not the meter that saves the water, it's just a bit of plastic and metal. It's the tunes you can play on it. And the smarter the meter, the more tunes you can play. And then you can do things on customer habits and leakage and water efficiency, other things. I would love to see all water companies chuck them, don't landfill them obviously, but dumb meters, no thank you, no more. Smart meters please for everybody. Let's not call it compulsory metering, it's just the metering programme. Really, it should not be beyond the wit of woman. I'm going to say woman as a generic term, it includes man. See what I did there, Nicci? We should be able to do this to fix this safety net for water poverty. That is incredibly important, but really look at the things we've managed to do in terms of innovating. We really should be able to fix that. My last word on this point, that too should be done at national level. And by national, again, I mean UK. The water companies are all doing brilliant things on water affordability and tackling water poverty, but they themselves in England are calling for a non-postcode lottery, and let's have that right across the UK. The safety net, the smart meters, and then they allow you to pass into the kind of surgery stage that Andrew's talking about.
You got us going there, Nicci.
I'm just not sure you're passionate enough, guys. I think that's my observation. That's good. It's really multifaceted, isn't it? I guess as we start to sum up, I'm interested from each of you, what next? Andrew and I wrote a wish list, so I'm not completely non-biased here, for water efficiency back end of last year for CIWEM's Environment magazine, which if you've not read, check it out. It's available online. So I've got a bit of a sense of some of the things, but if you were to be able to wave your magic water efficiency wand, so what are your top 2 wish list items to be able to really have the biggest impact at a system-wide level? Andrew first, go for it.
Given I've already had a bit of a session on metering, which would normally be in my 2, I pick these. I pick a national target. So we've got a national energy target from the Climate Change Act. It's a percentage reduction in CO2 from the nation. We have no equivalent in water. And without something equivalent in water, then there's nothing driving every single business out there. There's nothing driving in this water efficiency agenda across anywhere in households or business sectors other than wholesale water companies. That's got to change. And we've got to get the metric right. And the second one would be mandatory independent water labelling. We've got the energy label, the A to G that you see on your boiler, your TVs, your appliances, and we don't have the equivalent on water. A separate one is easier, like you see in other places around the world where it's very, very successful. But having that label to show the performance characteristics that you can compare to all other products in a shop or online is the only thing out there that will change and improve the water performance of every household and every business going forward.
Rob, what are your 2?
Well, Andrew nicked number 1, which is water labelling, and I think we'd probably all put that number 1. My second and third, they're not specific things per se, but I think they're really crucial. One is innovation. The water sector is quite a hard area to innovate in because at the end of the day, we're providing a public health service. You know, COVID's obviously shown that in terms of washing hands. But I think in terms of how we're regulated and how the water companies are able to look at different ways of delivering their services and engaging with customers, there's got to be more capacity for innovation and the ability to fail and say, okay, that didn't work, but we've got a better idea now. And the second one we've touched on a little bit would be leadership. It's a multi-stakeholder environment. There are diverse organisations and individuals involved, from householders to plumbers to builders to academics and government regulators. We really could do with someone at the helm of this and some really strong leadership from government, potentially, because, as we've discussed, things like labelling and metering are government-led interventions, but also some really smart way of interacting with people about this and really taking on board the idea that water it's central to our lives because it affects all the things that we do around cleanliness and hygiene and feeling good, the soaking the bath, having fun, playing water fights out in the garden. And like Nicci said, we don't want to be the water police, but we want to kind of influence how people consider water and link what they do in the home back to the environment. So I think that leadership piece is really important too.
Nicci, pressure's on. What are your two?
It's actually good going last because I knew one of them at least would pick label because that would have clearly been. So my other two, the first one is I think let's harness the opportunity that COVID's given us. So two quick examples. You've got a whole population now valuing water, right? Life and death every day. And the second one is we've got a whole new generation that digitally engaged. We've got this grandparent Zoom generation now. Let's use them. Let's engage with them on water efficiency. So that's the first one, harness the opportunity. The second one ties in with Rob's leadership point, and it's a thing I've been banging on about for years, is let's just get water efficiency a seat at the table where the big decisions are made. And talking about government, but also the water sector, water efficiency needs a seat at the table where people are talking about economic growth, net zero, housing, inequality. Let's get water efficiency part of those conversations. At the moment, it really is a bit too niche. And we just need to stick it in the middle of the table where all of those other issues that I've mentioned are being discussed.
What I'm taking from what you just said is things like climate change, inequality, all of those things are absolutely as pertinent to us in the UK as they are to any other country in the world. And actually water efficiency is a really big lever within all of that to be able to achieve things like net zero, to be able to achieve reduction in abstractions, and to be able to enable people to not live in water poverty. So fascinating debate, but it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Niki Russell, Rob Lawson and Andrew Tucker.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicci.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, Sophie, so what are your initial reflections on the interview?
Well, inevitably, as I'm sitting in government trying to do my part of resolving some of this problem, I sat there with a little bit like, tick, we've done that. Oh, no, we haven't done that. We haven't done that. The team talk to so many different people all the time about their ideas, and your contributors to this podcast are up there as being the most knowledgeable. We take their advice really seriously and do our best within DEFRA to try and make sure we're responding to it. But inevitably, there's been such a lot going on for government recently with COVID, of course, and EU exit. We don't perhaps make the progress that everyone in the sector would like us to. I think what being a good civil servant is not pretending that we have all the answers, and that's what I really like professionally, making connections outside of the department and knowing that we're hearing the views from people who really do know what they're talking about.
I think they'll be delighted to hear that you think that they're knowledgeable. We'll make sure they hear that. One of the things that came out for me was the importance of thinking about demand through a lot of different lenses, almost with a sort of systems type view. Are we approaching demand like that in the UK from your perspective?
I think we are more and more, but I think it's fair to say that was my reflection too, joining this world a couple of years ago. It could be looked at better as a system. One of the things we've been trying to do, which does respond to what came out in the interview, is look at overall demand and ensure we are making progress on leakage, on non-household demand and on household demand. Because just focusing in on one of those is not going to tackle the overall problem. And as COVID showed us, just focusing on each of those in isolation means you don't see the connections. So when London shuts down because of lockdown and all that demand shifts from office buildings into households in the southeast, you need to be able to flex for that. When installing smart metering addresses household demand but also addresses leakage, you need to be able to make those connections in order to make the case for that metering programme. So I feel much happier now that we're making those connections, and we're trying to bring together a senior group of people that can report on leakage, on non-household demand and on household demand, bring those together and say, overall, are all of these things falling and the trajectory we need them to be okay when we've got our really challenging climate change and population growth projections.
Do you feel, in the role that you're in DEFRA, that water has a seat at the table? Something that Nicci raised and I thought was interesting. Where the big decisions are made, does it feel like water is being considered within those, do you think?
Yeah, and I think that shows up in the 25-year environment plan, which was the really big government moment of saying, right, well, what are we going to do to benefit the environment, where water is one of the top sets of issues that needs to be considered for the overall water environment. I'm in conversations with colleagues working on the environmental land management scheme, so the replacement for farm subsidies now we've left the EU, and how farming interacts with water is an absolutely massive issue that we're talking about all the time. There are so many connections. Almost feels like a silly thing to say because it's so obvious, but
that's my theme. It's not that obvious. Let's not say that.
I mean, water is just there, isn't it? Everywhere in the environment, and everything you do in the environment impacts on water. And specifically thinking about water efficiency, ultimately, if we don't use less of it, we are not going to achieve those environmental improvements. So, I think water runs as a really thread through everything that we're doing in government. Could it be better? Yes, of course it could. I mean, the collaboration struggles you're talking about in the podcast, I mean, working across government on a knotty system issue is so hard, but it doesn't mean we're not trying.
You don't meet many people that are in this sector that don't feel a sense of passion about it. I think it's one thing that unites us all. We're all bothered. So if we think about reducing demand, I asked Nicci and Rob and Andrew what their priorities were. If I asked you the same question, what would you say, Sophie?
I'm going to stray into some of my personal perspectives here rather than government policy, but I think that's more interesting. I think we've got a big tanker to turn for people in this country of thinking that we need to worry about this. To some extent, I think that because 2 years ago I wasn't worried about this, sat there with my baby thinking, oh, the water job sounds interesting. And, I'm a civil servant and I'm pretty informed about issues. And it rains a lot, doesn't it? Let's be honest. So it's hard to convince people that they need to worry about using less water. So for me, the big priority has to be, how do we help people use less water without that being something that they have to think really hard about? Because if you're going to get them to think really hard about it, they have to be convinced there's a problem. And I'm not saying that's impossible. And that is something, the interviewers said this is something we're going to need to do, because it will really bite in a few decades' time. But in the meantime, before it's really bitten, I think we have to make their houses more efficient, water efficient, I mean. We have to make it so that people use less water without them really having to think about it. So on the tick list of things that were mentioned in the interviews, I really hope we'll make progress on labelling, because I think that will be one of the easy, quick wins. Well, it won't be quick, but one of the easy wins that will help everyone use less water quite quickly. I sit on a group looking at supply side things for water infrastructure. So, what are the reservoirs or desal plants or whatever that are going to need to be built? And in order to plan a new bit of supply, you need to have, a really big lead-in time, like 15 years. We obviously ask water companies to do that planning through the water resources management plans. And what really struck me in one of the early conversations I was part of was we have this demand reduction target that we ask water companies to plan for. But the uncertainty around that target is so great, but it's made even greater if you're relying on behaviour change. If you say to people, effectively, please use less water, then all you need is for a really hot stretch of days to come along, and people love filling up their paddling pools that we found last summer, or even for something more dramatic like COVID to happen, people being at home and they use less water. So another thing I think is important about addressing those things like a label in the home or changes to new builds and how they operate is that that's got more certainty attached to it. If you just find the wastage and build it out, then you can be confident that your plan for building reservoirs and desal plants is the right one.
Just thinking about that supply side for a second, we've talked a lot here about potable water, that comes into our homes and into our businesses. But you mentioned earlier that agriculture plays a huge part in this cycle, of course, and beyond that, I'm thinking about all of the uses of water that are non-potable and how that builds into your thinking. If we think about the water requirements for hydrogen potentially in the future as well, we're going to place quite a lot of additional demand on our systems, aren't we? How does that fit into your thinking within this whole system, if we just step back a little bit?
I do feel really lucky that I have this privileged position of sitting across so many different parts of the system, because I do look after, working with the Environment Agency, the licences for abstraction from the environment from all other uses of water. If you're a farmer, for example, you might be taking water from the environment. You might have an abstraction licence to take water to irrigate your crops. And you might also have, you hopefully do have a connection to the mains. And so we're careful that if you change something about an abstraction licence to reduce the water taken from the environment, that doesn't just flow immediately through to someone taking more from the mains, for more potable water to replace that river water they're using. And these systems are all connected. What I'm really excited by is the work of the regional water resources groups. So, for example, Water Resources East, having brought all of those users of water to the table to have a completely in the round conversation about where water goes. I'm also really excited by the work that Mosul has done using the data from reading meters and on water use by businesses, because we see so many interesting things there about water use by golf courses, for example, or where's the water going. And until you understand that, it's very hard to see how you can reduce demand. But actually there will be ways of reducing demand for water that don't ask people not to fill up their paddling pool, which ultimately they really want to be able to have a paddling pool, and do ask someone else to reduce water in a way that ultimately has very little impact.
It would be remiss of me then if I didn't talk to you about metering a little bit, because obviously we had quite a bit of discussion around whether we should have a compulsory metering strategy or not. I'd be really keen to hear either your thoughts or DEFRA's thoughts. Happy to listen to either or both, I guess, really, on that topic.
Well, I think it was Andrew in the interview who hit the nail on the head, which is there's a difference between the issue of metering and the issue of charging people for the amount of water that they use. And so, the DEFRA position is we want to see more meters. We'd like them to be smart meters that exactly build on the kinds of fantastic things that are going on in Thames and the amazing information you get from that wide rollout of a metering programme. But, it's a little bit perhaps easy to say that internationally other countries look in shock at the fact we don't have meters because it's so normal in other countries. And it isn't normal here, and it's a big change for people to say, especially with the financial problems people have right now because of COVID, to say that it's okay, your water bill should go up, or you should have a water meter because it's the right thing for the environment. I think we have to take people with us. And so the government has asked the Environment Agency to review the water stressed areas, and water stressed areas are then the priorities for rolling out compulsory metering programs. And water companies that want to have compulsory metering programs need to get customer support, and that's ultimately the right way round because it's a change for our customers. But I'm also, reassured by the fact that water company plans, slow and steady, we get to 85% metering penetration anyway by the 2040s. I think it will happen, but we can't move faster than the public, I think, on this one.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, thank you for being so candid, really. It's really helpful to hear. So what's working well then, in your view?
So I don't take any credit for this because I've been very lucky to inherit it, but I think it's been an enormous collective effort on water supply and demand to get to a point now where we're really clear about what we need to do. The National Infrastructure Commission, Water UK, and now the Environment Agency in the national framework they've published have really clearly set out what the gap is between the water that we need and the water that we would have if we didn't do anything about it by 2050. And everyone has come together to address that gap. And I mentioned about the regional water resources groups. They're doing what needs to be done on supply. And now we are really looking at the water demand side together as well, leakage, non-household and household efficiency. We will be exploring setting a target, a statutory target on government to reduce water demand, which will hold us to account, and we will hold everyone else to account for delivering what needs to be done. So I feel really confident that by 2050 we'll get there and there won't be the gap that was forecast, and really impressed with how everyone is working together so well to achieve that. Doesn't feel like any one person has made it happen. It's everyone in the system doing it together.
We've obviously, in the UK, we've got the Environment Bill that is greatly anticipated. Can you give us a sense of what that's got in store from a reducing demand perspective?
There's probably two things really relevant to reducing demand. One is this target that I mentioned. So the Environment Bill will create the power for government to set statutory targets that have to be met in order to deliver the environmental goals that we have. And we are looking at overall water demand and reducing it being one of those targets, which feels really important for the security of water supply for the future and for the impacts on the environment. The other thing, a bit at one remove, but there are some powers in the Environment Bill and indeed some powers in other legislation that we are confident are going to give us the ability to make a label on products, a water use label. So we're going to need to take more legislation through once we've designed that label, together with everyone who needs to be involved. But we will be able to do that, and I feel excited that in a few years' time we might start to see a label on products as a result of that. So good things to come, I think.
Well, I think that's one of the items on the wish list ticked off as well, isn't it, for our panel? So I'm sure they'll have been delighted. I am disappointed to say our time is running out, unfortunately. So just a huge thank you to you, Sophie. I've hugely enjoyed our conversation. I hope our listeners have too. I think my takeaway is that there really is a really big amount of energy to make a significant change in this area. And there's a real environmental and social imperative to make that happen kind of quickly. I guess the challenge is, how do we design that water reduction into our policies and products and services to kind of pull as many of those demand reduction levers as possible, as quickly as possible, really. So thank you so much for sharing your reflections. Here we are, the end of season 1 of Let's Talk WEM. And this is where I usually ask my guests to link between this episode and the next. And you might be expecting that I'd give that a miss as it's the end of the series. But fear not. Season 2 is on its way soon. And our first podcast will be all about climate change. And we'll be considering the intergenerational impacts of climate change and speaking with educators and school governors about exploring how it's being addressed with the next generation. So, Sophie, can you find a link between what we've just been talking about and climate change for me?
Oh, well, that's not very difficult, is it? Well, it's entirely because of climate change. Well, not quite entirely. Climate change and population growth, but climate change is going to affect the weather in the UK, and it's going to affect how much water we have. And that's why we have to reduce our demand for water so that we don't run out. So there you go. That's what, hopefully, you're going to learn about how to teach 4, 5 and 6-year-olds how to use less water.
Thanks so much, Sophie, for speaking to us on Let's Talk WEM. And now it's time to hear a bit more from Rebecca Pow MP, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at DEFRA. I spoke with her the other day and I asked her why water efficiency is so important.
Well, of course, water is such a precious resource, isn't it? And I think realisation and recognition about how we must not squander this precious resource is so important. And that's why the work that your organisation is doing is so important. And working really closely with my DEFRA team and my water team in DEFRA. Obviously, through the Environment Bill, we are delivering our 25-year environment plan. And within that, targets on dealing with water in a whole range of areas, but also looking at water efficiency will be set so that we can actually make a much more use of this resource, and indeed it needs to be sustainable. So making people, for example, aware of how much water they use through gadgets in the home, or even if gadgets are leaking, all of those things are going to be so important in signalling and helping us to better look after our water and then provide everybody with the water that they need.
It's great to hear that Rebecca recognises the importance of water, and that we'll see that reflected in the upcoming Environment Bill. And what a great way to finish Series 1 of Let's Talk WEM, getting the chance to discuss one of the really important issues in our sector with some of the key decision makers. Thank you so much for listening to this final episode in the first series of Let's Talk WEM. I really hope you've enjoyed the pod. I hope you've enjoyed the links our guests have made, and showing us that if we take time to lift our eyes up, there are connections in the most unexpected of places. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for Season 2, coming soon. And in the meantime, you can rate and review the pod on your usual podcast player. All it leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our guests today, Niki Russell, Rob Lawson and Andrew Tucker. And thanks to my wonderful co-host, Sophie Broadfield. That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Let's Talk WEM is produced by Bulb. BWLB Bulb. The best ideas, the strongest content.